Anyhow, why our founders supported impeachment. This is from July 20th, 1787. The men who were putting together the Constitution of the United States met in what's now referred to as Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, and I'm just going to share with you little pieces of the action. This is what James Madison wrote down. Now, it's not in all cases verbatim transcripts because Madison was not a, he wasn't a stenographer. So he summarized what people had to say. So it starts out, Mr. Pinckney observed that the president, and by the way, instead of the word, at this point in time, they had not yet decided that the president would be called the president. So they refer to him as the magistrate or as the executive or as he. So I'll just fill that in. That'll be the only change. Otherwise, you're hearing the founders' words themselves. Mr. Pinckney, he ought not to be impeachable whilst in office. Mr. Davey, but if he is not impeachable whilst in office, he'll spare no efforts or means whatsoever to get himself reelected. This is an essential security for the good behavior of the president. Colonel Mason, no point is of more importance than the right of impeachment should be continued. Shall the man who has practiced corruption and by that means procured his appointment in the first instance be suffered to escape punishment by repeating his guilt? Dr. Franklin, Ben Franklin, I'm for retaining the clause as favorable to the executive. Now, what does he mean by this? It's favorable to the president? He says, what was the practice before this in cases where the chief magistrate rendered himself obnoxious? Why, the recourse was had to assassination. It would be the best way, therefore, to provide in the Constitution for the regular punishment of the executive, where his misconduct should deserve it, and for his honorable acquittal, where he should be unjustly, were he to be unjustly accused. Mr. Governor Morris admits corruption and some few other offenses to be such as ought to be impeachable. Mr. Madison thought it indispensable, this is James Madison writing about himself, thought it indispensable that some provision should be made for defending the community against incapacity, negligence, or perfidy of the chief magistrate. He might pervert his administration into a scheme of peculation. That's an old 1700s word that means enriching yourself with public money. He might pervert his administration into a scheme of peculation or oppression. In the case of the executive magistracy, which is to be administered by a single man, loss of capacity or corruption was more within the compass of probable events, and either of them might be fatal to the republic. Mr. Gerry, after whom we named gerrymanders, Mr. Gerry urged the necessity of impeachments. A good magistrate, in other words, a good president, will not fear them. A bad one ought to be kept in fear of them. He hoped the maxim would never be adopted here that the chief magistrate could do no wrong. Mr. King, now Rufus King was the one guy who was opposed to impeachment, right? Mr. King expressed his apprehensions. The executive was to hold his place for a limited time. He would be periodically tried for his behavior by his electors, who would continue or discontinue him. Therefore, he ought to be subject to no intermediate trial by impeachment. But under no circumstances ought he to be impeachable by the legislature. This would be destructive of his independence. Mr. Randolph, guilt wherever found ought to be punished. The executive will have great opportunities of abusing his power, particularly in time of war, when the military force and in some respects the public money will be in his hands. Should no regular punishment be provided, it will be irregularly inflicted by tumults and insurrections. Dr. Franklin. Dr. Franklin mentioned the case of the Prince of Orange. There's a whole long story about a corrupt, Brit, right? Had he been impeachable, this is Ben Franklin's words, had the Prince of Orange been impeachable, a regular and peaceable inquiry would have taken place, and he would, if guilty, have been duly punished. If innocent, restored to the confidence of the public. Mr. King, again, the lone voice against impeachment. They are unnecessary, the periodical responsibility of the electors being an equivalent security. Mr. Pinckney, his powers would be so circumscribed as to render impeachments unnecessary. Pinckney was also opposed to impeachment. Governor Morris's opinion had been changed by the arguments used in the discussion. He was now sensible of the necessity of impeachments. This is what Morris said. He may be bribed by a greater interest to betray his trust. And no one would say that we ought to expose ourselves to the danger of seeing the first president in foreign pay without being able to guard against it by displacing him. The executive ought, therefore, to be impeachable for treachery. On the question, shall be the executive, and that was the end of Governor Morris's rant, and then they called the vote. He says, on the question, shall the executive be removable by impeachment? Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia said yes, 8 votes yes. Massachusetts and South Carolina, 2 votes no. So there you go. That's literally what the founders said. And what did they say? That the main reasons that they said they thought that a president should be impeachable, number 1, he might enrich himself from the government coffers. Like, for example, having government officials stay in his hotels. Or number 2, he might be in the pay of foreign or in obligation to, in debt to foreign governments. You just heard it in the words of the founders themselves.